I believe very strongly that we have a role to play in that part of the world. But I think the wrong role we're playing is assuming that our military involvement, continued involvement, is something that's ready and constructive of. The most important job of an American president is to keep us safe and secure, to keep us less vulnerable and less isolated around the world. And I believe very strongly that over the last 6 years, here in the last 4.5 years of this conflict, we are less secure, less safe, more vulnerable, and more isolated as a result of our continued military presence. I must say I was rather stunned a week or two ago at one of these so-called debates in Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, when Tim Russell asked the following question of the candidates: would you make a commitment by the end of your first term that we would have our combat forces out of Iraq? I fully expected by the time they got to me, because they normally don't get to me very quickly based on how these processes run, the question would be adequately answered. I was sort of stunned that the so-called three leading candidates for this nomination answered that they would not make that. That's 6 to 7 years from now. I will tell you before this evening, as I said at Dartmouth, absolutely. I hope we don't have to wait to 2009, let alone 2013. I believe this tactic of our military presence is a massive mistake for this country, and it ought to end. I hope you agree with me on that issue. I found it breathtaking in some ways here that the candidacy is unwilling to make that commitment, considering the folly of this decision. That's not to say that our troops have not done an admirable job under very difficult circumstances. I served in the Peace Corps in Latin America back in the 1960s, but I then also served in the military. I was in the National Guard and Reserves. Here I tell audiences Thomas Jefferson was president when I served in the I'm no great war hero, not a war hero at all, but nonetheless have some idea of what it means to care about troops and soldiers. And while I'm talking about cutting off the funding for this conflict, I get very offended when people suggest that somehow we're putting our troops at jeopardy by doing it. They've obviously never served in the military, they wouldn't make such a silly statement. Obviously, a redeployment of forces requires you invest to make sure that the redeployment occurs safely and securely for the people you're removing from an area. The suggestion somehow that by cutting off the funding for this policy places troops at risk is offensive to me that anyone even buy into that argument. And I find it particularly offensive that the administration would make that case. On 4 different occasions over the last 4 years, I offered the language to provide additional costs of body armor for the troops in that conflict. It was defeated all 4 times by the president's enablers in Congress. I watched them also underestimate the troops coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who would need help with the Veterans Administration, as they've underfunded the programs to provide for these kids coming back who've been broken in so many different ways. So when they talk about the troops and caring about them, when I realized how inadequate the support existed for those in harm's way, let alone those coming back, I frankly get more than just annoyed. They tell me how much they care about the troops and why we need to maintain these policies. And on this point, let me make this case. The Constitution of the United States gives the Congress one unique power. We don't have the power to manage the day-to-day conflicts around the world, and nor should we. The idea that 535 members of Congress would be deciding what ought to happen day-to-day in combat situations would be foolishness on its face. And the Constitution rightfully rests that power in the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief. The power the Constitution gives us is to cut off the funding for something we think is wrong. And so I find it offensive that Democrats were given the power, thanks to many of you in this room and elsewhere, a year ago, November, by for the first time in 14 years, make it possible to be the chairman of the committee. And yet I sense the frustration that people feel all across this country that a year later, we haven't been able to do a better job to terminate the funding through the power that we were given by the Constitution, and that is to stop funding this conflict. That ought to be I want you to know, look, I'm not leaving the region either. This is not just about the military. Obviously, what offends me is the suggestion that the only way we deal with matters is through our military force. We have wonderful tools in our arsenal of tools, diplomacy, and politics, and economics to make a difference in relationships. People say, well, you're going to leave Iraq in a far more chaotic state than it is today. It's hard to imagine how it could be much more chaotic. I've been there a number of times. 4 million people are displaced, 80,000 died. The country is virtually a basket case as a result of this continued civil conflict in the country that I think we're contributing to by our continued presence in the country. I will tell you, just to confirm this, and again, it's not scientific, I was at Walter Reed Hospital a few weeks ago. You see a young soldier from Torrington, Connecticut, who lost his eye in the Anbar province. And was sitting with a group of his friends. And we're in Walter Reed. And I asked him what it was like, what was going on. And I almost quoted him. He said, Senator, look, he said, we're in an area, we'll clean it out, take a month and a half to do so. An hour and a half after we clean it up, it's right back where it was, an hour and a half. He said, the civilian population, they know where the ammo dumps are, the IEDs are, they won't share the information, just for whatever reason. That you need to know that it's okay for people to kill us. He said, what are we doing here? He says, he honestly believes that our continued presence is creating more of a problem. So I can't guarantee what's going to happen in Iraq once we leave, except that I know that continuing what we're doing is only going to make it more difficult for them to get on their feet, and more difficult for us to deal with other issues around the world. We've got to grapple with, not to mention the domestic issues at home. Every other foreign policy issue we're dealing with is seen through the prism of Iraq, whether it's Darfur, whether it's Latin America, whether it's the Far East. Our inability to build the kind of relationships around the world is directly and adversely affected because of the rigidity on this idea that we have to stay in Iraq. And some would suggest maybe as late as 2013, which I find incredible, that a Democratic candidate for the presidency, anyone, would be advocating a policy and that would not commit to have our troops out before the end of their first